So, you know how we just talk about racism constantly these days? Well, yeah, because we suddenly have diversity across the entire Western world. So, if you have all these diverse people sharing nations, what happens next? Faced with so many modern complications that come with diversity, we largely choose from our four directions: left wing, right wing, atheism, or religion. And I use the American context here, so atheism has a decent amount of association with evolutionary theory, and religion as a perspective mostly means Christianity here. Now, choosing whichever of these, we have one force that is elevated as more important than all of these other considerations is not being racist. Well, that is the applied lesson, and naturally, many proponents of these different views argue over which competing perspective is the racist one. But hold up there. Were any of these perspectives naturally just inherently non racist? Well, that's the public view. What do the experts think? We'll start with a little bit on what I would consider atheism, and I justify that within evolution with studies like this one. This study was formed by sending out a questionnaire to a lot of different scientists in different disciplines, separating by discipline, and trying to find who believes in God the least and who believes in God the most. So it has 6 different possible answers, but I'm going to concentrate here on the I do not believe in God, the assurance of atheism, and I have no doubts about God's existence, which would be on your entirely opposite certainty of God's existence, even if that's different from a conventional imagination of God. So what I'm highlighting here is mainly the physics and the biology, because they have the highest percentage of do not believe in God in this response by a good deal compared to the other disciplines, and especially biology. That's going to be very important in terms of the evolutionary theory. And in contrast too, they have very low rates of I have no doubts about God's existence. And as we see at the bottom for these two, they have particularly low percentage of attending religious church services or religious services at all over the course of the past year. So we really get the idea that in comparison to other disciplines of science, that these two, physics and biology, have particularly low belief in God, particularly low belief and involvement in any sort of religious service as a result, potentially, of their exact expertise. And in public school then, why did you have to learn about evolution, which again related to biology? If your incredibly distant ancestors looked like monkeys or were in the image of God, it doesn't really matter in terms of how we live in modern times, other than if it's an effective method of increasing atheism. Then there's clearly a reason to teach evolution in prehistory. You can have more atheists coming out of high school, exactly as we were just seeing on the last study, which tells us that these are the disciplines you want to concentrate on if you want to increase atheism. But what's the purpose beyond that? I really don't want to waste my time on science, which just tells me about a history which apparently mattered a lot, but did not result in divergent evolution in humans. At least that's where the public school education ends very explicitly. As soon as recorded history begins, evolution stops suddenly. And despite people evolving so long separately, continentally separated populations magically ended up the same in important biological abilities. But as far as relevant information goes, we could just skip the studies of prehistory entirely and look at current biological differences. What can we learn about variable bone densities, height, skin, facial structures, skull shapes, brain shapes? And if we learn this, it would be enormously useful in navigating the world that we live in. But it's also something that's really easy to study. That's not just me, that's the professional biologists. See, the other key to this is that it's not just that they have a low belief in God here. Within this field of science, we see increases in racial belief of some type. First study from Mooring 2004, they went through and checked a whole lot of American biology textbooks from different eras. And we started in 1952. Non-medical descriptions of race were up. And then we get down and down. And each era, except for particularly recently, 1993 to 2002, we had a decrease in the non-medical description of race. However, very consistently, we had medical description of race increasing in textbooks up through 1993 to 2002, at which point we have 93% of medical descriptions of race. We have the name of a clear European here in 2007, and there we just find that in China there just is consensus. There's consensus that groups of people should be grouped racially at 100%, and no articles at all that people are not grouped racially. And this is only really in contrast to the Western world. The Western world is the only part of the world that is trying to suppress belief in race to such a great extent, even within the scientific fields. Then we have Lieberman, 1992, and we find biologists, physical anthropologists, races are real for 70% of biologists and for 49% of physical anthropologists. Now, how does that look on a chart? By the level of degree that they go through. It looks like this. In blue, we have biologists, and right around 70% agree with the statement that human races exist. And again, this is a comparison within the Western world, so this is really the lowest that we can get. It's going to be 100% agreeing that races exist within China, and a very high percentage agreeing that races exist within non-China, non-West countries. And pointing this out, we have Kazitsha, 2009, in which we get the total number of respondents saying that 50% believe that races exist, and it's considerably higher in Eastern Europe, considerably lower in Western Europe for the belief in races existing, and it's also different depending on your age, in this case, for both Eastern and Western Europe. So that's ultimately the lesson that education clearly wants us to learn. We get purposefully walked through the part of the discipline that particularly effectively erodes belief in God, but we skip the relevant modern parts that effectively increase belief in human races, even under systems that benefit from people not recognizing the existence of race. There's no reason to teach evolution if you do not teach the parts that are most relevant to our modern lives. So the purpose of stopping short is to create the type of person that our state wants. Very telling that those leftists who celebrate science mistakenly believe that such scientific education has enlightened them to be anti-racist. You really do have to be taught, and taught with deliberately selected partial knowledge, to be a good anti-racist. Just think about this. The skin is the mediator between inside and outside. It affects the nutrients you can take in, how you sweat out, and generally how the insides of your body are defended from or benefit from the external environment. Dismissing race as skin deep is ridiculous, even if it were just skin, because the skin itself would still be doing vastly different things for your insides as a crucial functional part of your entire body. It's everywhere around you. Melanin blocks out vitamin D, and to live in the cold, you need that vitamin D and also extra hair. So if we didn't have electricity, these Africans living in North America, Europe, they would have to move south or die. So the next time you talk about race and skin, think about that. But it's not just skin. It's skull shape, it's cranial capacity, it's brain shape. And not only do we have study after study on this, which is why acknowledging race is naturally so high in biologists and medical staff, it's something that you can just see to check for yourself on a daily basis. I shouldn't have to refer to this study that mentions variable cranial capacities and variations in the size of a woman's birth canal, because it's natural for a woman to give birth to a baby of her own race, therefore a baby with the appropriate size of skull. I shouldn't have to tell you about that, and I shouldn't have to tell you because you've walked around a diverse world and you've seen people of different races. You've seen variable facial shapes as the result of these different skull shapes. You've seen the variable heights in different races of people, and you've seen the vast differences in eyes and hair, both having their place inside the head. But you're making the absolutely insane claim that the only one inside part of this entirely different head is fundamentally the same, the brain. Oh, and also, Despite us being fundamentally the same in the brain exclusively, we somehow ended up creating vastly different civilizations when separated. And I guess as a result, you'd assume of the brain, right? This common wall of anti-racism, though, associated often with atheism, is only possible with education that allows for purposeful atheism and purposeful anti-racism. But let me show you exactly how deliberate and political this approach can be.
The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully.
It really is shockingly disingenuous as an approach to use racism as a critique of the Old Testament. And this isn't a minor point of his. This is the first thing anyone reads when looking at Dawkins' major book. And he didn't say this once. He read this same passage during talk after talk. So the purpose of this as a major critique seems the exact same as the purpose in public school of teaching plenty about evolution, but not the relevant parts. And the relevant parts being the biological differences of modern races, or the biological differences of genetic clusters, if you would prefer. And as an evolutionary biologist, it's not just that Dawkins comes from the exact background in science, most likely to be atheist due to recognizing evolution. He comes from a background that is so likely to recognize race in humans due to recognizing the differential results of evolution in continental populations. And not just that, he also wrote a book called The Selfish Gene, which here Dawkins uses the term selfish gene as a way of expressing the gene-centered view of evolution, as opposed to the views focused on the organism and the group, popularizing ideas developed during the 1960s by W.D. Hamilton and others from the gene-centered view. It follows that the more two individuals are genetically related, the more sense, at the level of the genes, it makes for them to behave selflessly with each other. So let's apply this central concept to races of people. Well, that would describe in-group preference, and it sounds like having in-group preference is a healthy and natural condition. So racial preference equals racism would be an aspect of natural and healthy organisms. Well, what then are you trying to do if the leading criticism of Christianity in one of his books is entirely predicated on racism being bad? Why would he possibly care? Why not lead with some scientific point? And the answer to this second question is that by the time the book came out, people already were very responsive to accusations of racism. They were already programmed. It's back to a concentrated effort to demand anti-racism, which from Dawkins' genetic explanations would be encouraging people to go against their biological nature, to subvert their own group interests. This while the non-white world works towards their own group interests. Certainly, if we are using the scientific view of evolution, which is so often an inspiration for atheism as it was for Dawkins, we shouldn't be saying the God of the Old Testament was racist as a bad thing. We should say that the God of the Old Testament was racist, which makes perfect sense, and can therefore make even more sense in either reflecting some racial reality, or at least reflects the racism which was natural to the authors, to uneducated man under harsh Darwinian conditions, where racism was important in the survival of any tribe on any part of the earth. Now, given that the most politically relevant aspect of evolution is divergent evolution, that we just would absolutely have to see as a result of evolution occurring in vastly different areas, and we absolutely do see those results in modern biology and the medical community, well, if you politically care about anti-racism, then wouldn't it make a lot more sense to throw evolutionary theory out and embrace religious beliefs that are still pretty opposed to evolution in humans? Christianity is a perfect example then. It doesn't fit well with the full theory of evolution applied to humans, And Christians normally do push against such scientific theories that prove racism to be natural as a result of major biological differences. But no, just like in your public school textbooks, we must purposely walk you through evolution enough to shake your belief in a creator, but ignore the modern day results. Ignore the most politically irrelevant and most easily investigated information. But this ridiculous blind spot is required while pointing at the Bible and saying, hey, God is racist. This lets us see the second wall of anti-racism. This criticism was very effective for many people. Very effective because he's able to point at stories and verses from the Old Testament especially. Well, we have the purity laws in Leviticus, and it's easy enough to interpret those laws as commanding the Israelites to not mix with others when expressing the purity laws of keeping different kinds separate, which is further indicated as relating to the people of Israel keeping separate in Deuteronomy 7:3. And certainly the instructions for the temple were particular to Israelites, segregating out non-Israelites, just as in Deuteronomy 23:3, which expressed how 10 generations in or longer, potentially forever, Ammonites and Moabites would not enter. All of this climaxes with Numbers 25:6 to 25:8, where we find God displeased with the mixed orgies and idol worship going on. So therefore gave Israel a plague, but what pleased God ultimately and ended the plague suddenly is stabbing a mixed couple to death as they tried to enter the temple. And for all the laws we have just touched on, it's your decision if this was pleasing to God due to maintaining the segregation of the temple, or in ending the mixed relationship, or in punishing for foreign religious practices. But these sound pretty racist, don't you think? And as this was good to uphold such laws of separation in a brutal way that we simply would not do now, I should mention that for Nehemiah 13:3, that the people of Israel did understand the purity laws to mean people and therefore separation of people, as they understood the laws to separate out the, quote, mixed population. I think you can start to see what Dawkins was accusing God of there. But I actually take it a bit further. Matthew 5:17 tells us that the law is not to be undone, but fulfilled. And appropriately, given that 1 Corinthians 10:6 tells us that events of the Old Testament occurred for us to learn from such mistakes and to avoid doing what they did. This is especially about the same event of mixed orgies, sexual immorality, and idol worship that Numbers 25 is about, as 1 Corinthians 10:8 references that exact story. Given these New Testament instructions to learn from these exact events, I go further by saying the New Testament also contains plenty that modern people consider racist. The separation of people, as the Israelites understood and practiced, didn't disappear in the New Testament. It didn't disappear for modern Israel, and it didn't disappear for hundreds and hundreds of years of Christian nations. This might make even more sense when seeing the continued repetition of boundary laws in both the New and Old Testament. Acts 17:26 reminds us that despite shared origins, we were to have separate boundaries between different peoples, relating to the way in which Israel was separated by ancestry, but then as a message delivered outside of Israel. With the descriptions I'm giving you here, you shouldn't be surprised that Christian segregationists, border advocates, could pull directly from Scripture throughout our entire history, and that's why Christian nations never embraced diversity in the past. There's plenty of room in biblical interpretation to support your own group interests. And actually, that's the long-running understanding, the default interpretation within Christianity. All of this is to say that this is why Dawkins used racism as a criticism of Christianity and why it worked. Because he's right. That's been a part of Christianity for hundreds of years, or any religion, ultimately. And as I just covered in my last video, Christianity is still racially conscious and used to advocate for group interest within non-white congregations. So if you want to call the Bible racist in the way that Dawkins uses the term, well, the answer is yes. And you also have to say that non-white congregations all over the world are racist, which is true. Plus you have to say that the entirety of the past of Christian nations was racist, which is true. If it's then starting to sound like racism is the natural condition for all people, biological differences so obvious that It makes sense to care for your own group, just as Dawkins writes. Put your group interests first, and to keep people away who are too different. Well, then we should be happy to learn that the Bible is racist, because it's not a biological suicide pact to ensure the erasure of Western cultures and people from this planet. And these modern racial differences are so easily observable daily and studied that if the Bible was not racist by such a definition to say races exist and there are differences, I would doubt the writing far more. Okay, two walls of anti-racism down there. Science is racist and constantly offering more evidence of racial differences. Christianity is racist in scripture and in historical practice. And the demand, therefore, of anti-racism is just blatantly a demand to destroy the community that you had and give away all your hard work towards the detriment of your own children. That this demand is made against observable nature and against history, you should know already that there is purposefully no permanent salvation offered in attempting to be an anti-racist even after you're dead. It's a trick. It's a shakedown, a subversion of your group interests, an accusation of heresy that you purposely cannot escape from precisely because nature and all of human history is racist. But they're pointing the finger at you, and that's their power. Okay, walls 3 and 4 of anti-racism left, and we'll have our entire building of anti-racism. Let's open some more windows in the left-right Democrat-Republican arguments. With that, I've already said we should be able to see what the left and right accusations of racism are. In a diverse nation, if you respond to crime, education, taxes with an equal approach, then that is a reason to accuse the modern right of racism. And simply because diverse people have different averages in skills or issues, you'll get different racial results when applying some sense of equality, which is why the left has switched to equity. For the same reason, when we say that nature has separated people and made them significantly different, the right accusing the left of the soft bigotry of low expectations is always self-defeating because, well, biological differences simply exist. So we need to expect differences, and they're very, very easy to study. So equity is just the natural communist conclusion of legislating in defiance of all nature and history, but more accurately, legislating toward the detriment of white people, because this entire system depends on disadvantaging or harming white people and disrupting all our communities, all of the ways that we naturally like to live in. Ultimately, if anyone is debating who's a racist in politics, you're just saying, okay, who is creating policies that either address differential human nature as it is, or who is creating policies that ignore this reality? This is before we look at history. So Democrats and slavery, the KKK, or Republicans and harsher policing. For that matter, it's easy to find Republicans that supported the Back to Africa movement. You should understand, though, that no matter who is called racist politically, the design of this conversation is to accuse white people as something uniquely wrong to have group interests, and especially poor white people who have the greater struggle in survival. They will never stop finding ways to disrupt Southern and rural whites, calling us racist as a means of justifying our destruction, since they know that the Confederacy had a chance at disrupting this greedy system that entirely depends on refusing to support the interests of our own people. There is no escape, no non-racist future, no end of the anti-whiteness, and that's the point. But I hope you can see the consequences of refusing to recognize racial realities. The walls of anti-racism are constructed around your mind and constructed in a highly purposeful way. But in reality, just look out one of the many windows there. See that there are very real differences and very real dangers for our future if we do not act collectively towards our interests constantly, no matter what it takes. And I'll say to conclude this, though, is the best argument I've heard yet to why to keep these walls around our minds.
Don't be racist. I am a building and I've got news for you. Hey, there's Steven. Blacks and whites are even. How would you feel if the joke was on you? Blacks, whites, Indians, and Spanish, they all came from the sea. We all have to share the same world. Trixie, won't you sing with me?
Hey, Stan.
Hey there, Trixie.
What you singing about?
Oh, not much. Just skyscraper stuff, like racism. Don't be racist. We both are buildings. Listen to what we mean. Love one another, sisters and brothers, or we will haunt your dreams. Or we will haunt your dreams. Or